Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, and answering your questions tonight, venture capitalist and philanthropist Mark Carnegie, the Minister for Health, Tanya Plibersek, futurist Jason Silva, who'll be telling the Festival of Ideas, the dangerous ideas I should say, that technology is on the brink of making us all into gods, best-selling Australian novelist Elliot Perlman, and rising Liberal Party MP Kelly O'Dwyer. Please welcome our panel. Q&A is live from 9:35 Eastern Standard Time. It is simulcast on News 24 and News Radio. Go to our website to send a question or join the Twitter conversation using the hashtag that just appeared on your screen. Well, tonight we've also been joined by a small audience in Newcastle, an experiment with what we're calling Q&A Plus. We'll come back to Newcastle soon, but our first question tonight is in the audience here. It's from Will Bertolo.
Tony, the YMCA New South Wales Youth Parliament, of which 10 of us tonight were recently involved in, recently debated same-sex marriage, where it passed overwhelmingly 79 to 11. With recent landslide defeats in both the Senate and House of Representatives, do you think this is a younger generational issue, or do you think the tides will turn for the current generation?
Jason, let's start with you. There's a big issue in the United States as well. Obama has endorsed gay marriage now.
Finally.
But, getting it through the Congress is going to be another thing, just as it was getting it through the House of Representatives and the Senate here.
Well, I mean, I, for one, totally support gay marriage. I'm not so sure about marriage in general, but I totally support gay marriage. And I think it's about time that Obama has come around to that. I certainly think that young people, I do think it's a generational thing. I think young people today, they're more connected than ever before. They feel closer to each other than ever before. And I think for that reason, it's harder for people to be isolated for something that has gone mainstream. And I think it's about time that loving one another has come mainstream, no matter what sex you are. So,
Tanya Plibersek.
Well, I voted in favour of it. I think it's pretty hard to say to one group in society that because of one arbitrary thing about them, that they don't have access to something that is important socially, legally, economically, in a whole range of different ways. I also think it's a bit rich when you hear people saying gay men and lesbians are promiscuous, and at the same time denying them access to marriage, which is such an important symbol of faithfulness in a relationship. And you do hear the same argument from the same people. You hear both of those propositions made. I think to the young man who asked the question, it's really important that young people don't give up in fights for equality, and you don't have to look back too far. I think in fact, in New South Wales, homosexuality was only legalised, I think it was in 1981, I don't remember the exact year, but it was 3 years after the first vote for legalisation was resoundingly defeated. I think there is in most societies, there is a trend towards greater equality, and this is part of that trend towards greater equality. And I always want to be on the side of reducing discrimination and greater equality, and I think that we will get there in the end.
How hard is it to get up an issue like this when the Prime Minister herself advocates a no vote?
Look, I think it's plain that there is a range of different views in the Parliament, and I'm proud at least to be in a party that has legislated 84 different pieces of legislation to remove discrimination in 84 other pieces of legislation with the Prime Minister's support. At the National Conference, we took a decision as a party that we support marriage equality, but that there would be a conscience vote in the Parliament. And I think it would be terrific if the other major party, the Liberal Party, that always bangs on about how they have conscience votes, would also have given its members a conscience vote on this really important issue.
Let's go to Kelly O'Dwyer. Make the point here. You voted no, you didn't have a choice.
Well, certainly. I think this issue is a very complicated one. I mean, any social change is pretty complex, and I think it's right that we actually have a very strong community consensus when there is social change, and this is quite a significant social change. Now, we took a policy before the last election that there would be no change to the Marriage Act. We honour our promises, unlike the government. We think it's important to honour your promises when you are in a position where you are making promises to the electorate about what you will do if you are honoured with their trust in government. Now, we haven't seen that...
Can I just interrupt you there? Does that mean if you had the free choice, you would have voted no.
Well, look, on the issue of the conscience vote, I think Tanya makes a very interesting point, because the Labor Party made much of the fact that they had a conscience vote on this issue. They only decided, though, to have a conscience vote on this issue when it was very apparent that the party platform would change. The Labor Party platform binds parliamentarians, which would have meant that all of the Labor parliamentarians would have
what would
actually
your
have
conscience have dictated to you personally?
But this is an important point, though, Tony, because...
If you had a conscience vote, what would you have voted?
But Tony, if you can just let me finish this one point, because it is important. It would have meant, of course, that all of the Labor members of Parliament would have actually voted for a change to the Marriage Act if they had been bound. But the Prime Minister decided to be a little bit tricky, and she decided to actually make a change. And so she said that on this policy issue they would vote differently. Now, we made a commitment, as I said, going into the next election. We will no doubt talk about this issue again. Civil unions may come up. I don't know if that's something that the Labor Party is going to be bringing forward. I suspect that across
but just to bring you, because we haven't got a lot of time, just to bring you to the point that I asked, if you had a conscience vote yourself, would you have voted yes or no?
Well, I mean, it's a hypothetical question. I've been on the record...
Your conscience is hypothetical?
No. It's a hypothetical question as to how I would have voted. I mean, we took a position as a party on this issue.
Would you be prepared to reveal publicly what your position is?
Well, I have publicly stated my support for civil unions, and that's my public position.
OK. Elliot Perlman. We can reflect on the question here. There was a question I think Kelly O'Dwyer raised, whether there's community consensus or not, and yet we hear from this younger parliament of the YMCA that a tremendous percentage of people voted in favour of gay marriage.
I think Australians all over the country, no matter where they fall on the left-right spectrum, whether they're straight or gay, would agree that one of the hardest things to get right is a long-term monogamous relationship. And it's probably in the interest of the whole country that we, as a nation, foster and assist those kind of relationships. So any institutional barriers to those kind of relationships probably not good for the country. I think the tide of history is on the side of same-sex marriages, and I think eventually there will be a majority which will lead to a vote in both Houses of Parliament which will support the proposition that essentially no government in Australia has the right to tell Australian people who they can love.
Well said.
Mark Carnegie, your turn.
Not much to add other than I think, given that tonight is a night of futurology, I don't think there's many people in the room who would believe that in 20 years this law hasn't changed. I think this is only a debate of the matter of time. The one question I just keep on coming back to is whether or not the condition that a friend of mine wants to impose on the legalisation of gay marriage actually is part of the thing. He believes, my friend John Singleton, who's done it 5 times, that you should legalise gay marriage on one condition, and that is that you ban straight marriage.
Sorry.
So can I go ahead?
No, I was just going to say, I think the whole issue of legislating taste, particularly if you're not hurting anybody else, is kind of absurd for the government to feel like they can legislate what's right and what's wrong. If nobody is hurting anybody else, then you should be able to do whatever you want. And it's absurd, I think, to try and legislate taste. Because who's to say? Everybody's different. Everybody likes some different things, different tastes. So, I mean,
it's about the idea of making government so small that it actually fits inside your bedroom.
Yes.
Let's move along. Our next question comes from Virginia Hookham.
Federal Labor seems to be rising in opinion polls lately, due partly to personal attacks on Tony Abbott and announcements of massive new programs. Why is it then that the media, particularly the ABC, has not challenged Labor on unfunded promises that are so obviously directed at doing one thing only, boosting the image of the Prime Minister?
Mark Carnegie.
Well, to me, there's a whole series of things that are wrong with that statement as a business person at the moment. I think the first thing is, this year we've had a very, very difficult backdrop to the economy, but the government has sat there and tried to be as fiscally disciplined as it possibly can. The thing that's happened is that a whole series of special pleading and regulatory capture by a whole series of interest groups, mostly on the right of politics, plus what the McKinsey report talks about, which is a huge amount of declines in productivity as a consequence of the right of politics and management means that the government is under a huge, huge pressure at the moment. And if you look at the two things that are the most important in the new initiatives that the government worries about funding, the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Gonski Commission, for $12 billion, I think both of those things should be seen as investments rather than expenses. And I worry far more about the fact that if we don't invest in these areas now, the unfunded promises of either side of the parliament are going to be 10 times as bad when the demographic tsunami hits us.
Tanya Plibersek.
Well, on the question of polling, I'd say one swallow does not a summer make, and certainly we're not fixated on the polling at all. The allegation about unfunded promises is just Liberal rhetoric. Twice a year, every government accounts for all its spending and all its saving. It's called the budget. Everybody knows that happens in May, and the mid-year economic forecast, which will happen in the next few weeks, where every spending measure and every saving measure will be laid out there for everybody to see. What we don't know is how Tony Abbott's going to fill his $70 billion black hole, the black hole that Joe Hockey admits is there, that Andrew Robb admits is there, we've got no indication. Joe Hockey says that there is a list of savings that he's worked up and he's got them there ready, but he's not prepared to show them according to the Charter of Budget Honesty. He's not prepared to show them to Treasury, to get them costed, to make them public in any way.
Okay,
one more thing, Tony.
You're talking about but as our questioner
Yep.
pointed out, you're talking about the opposition. She, and I believe a lot of people do want to know where the $12 billion plus the other policies
and like I say,
is actually going to come from.
There's, the mid-year economic forecast will be out in a matter of weeks, and everybody will be able to read it there. And I challenge Joe Hockey to put his costings on the table at the same time. And I just have to say this about...
Will that tell us where the $6 billion for the Gonski money...
Of course it will.
So
It'll tell you
much
where
of the
all the
money,
spending and all the saving will come from.
How much of the $6 billion extra funding for to end school inequality will be there in that report?
Well, you have to look at the mid-year economic forecast.
I really don't want this to turn into party politics. The $6 billion for Gonski is not an expense. It's a critical investment in our country's future. Just because... we have a set of national accounts that puts that in the expense line. It's an outrage that people are sitting there and fighting about whether or not, in a country that is going to have less and less people working, we don't invest in our children. It absolutely staggers me.
Let's go to Kelly O'Dwyer and see if you agree.
Well, surprisingly, Tony, I don't. I agree on a couple of broader points, though, and that is we have to look to the future. We actually do have to look to the future because we have to think about who ultimately is going to have to pay for all of this. Because at the end of the day, the person who pays is the Australian taxpayer, and that bill gets paid at some point. So if we want our children born into debt, where their future is effectively mortgaged from the day that they are born, then let's do exactly. Well, just let me finish. Then let's do exactly.
Debt in the
then let's
OECD,
do exactly what you say.
cannot be sitting there and saying this. It's Q&A. This is not some low-rent tabloid thing. No, it is. I'm sorry. You have the lowest government debt in the OECD. We have $700 billion of national debt, and we have the highest household debt in the developed world, and yet the Liberal Party spends all its time talking about a trivial amount of government debt because it polls really well. And we're sitting there and saying, $6 billion a year to change the education system to make Australia globally competitive. Somehow that's a terrible thing to do.
So Mark, it's not trivial, okay? The money that is being spent is not trivial. The Financial Review actually looked at all of the new spending announcements that have been announced by this government, and they've said it's $120 billion.
That story is wrong,
give me a chance. I gave you a chance, Tanya.
It's just wrong.
Well, it's not wrong. It's absolutely not wrong.
It's wrong.
I mean, we can have a he said, she said sort of, is it wrong, is it not wrong? Well, the fact is the numbers are there, and it's very clear that that the government is not fiscally responsible. We had today the Treasurer make an announcement, and he made an announcement about the final budget outcome. Now, you know, the deficit that was meant to be around about $22 billion was actually $43.7 billion. That's rather a blowout. The net debt, which was meant to be, you know, around about $106 billion, blew out by $40 billion to be $143.7 billion. So this is not a government that's got everything under control. Plus, every single spending
can I just
announcement...
interrupt your flow just for a second, just to answer this fundamental point that's been made at this end of the table, and that is $6 billion to end, or to at least tackle, inequality in our public schools and our schools generally. Good idea, bad idea?
Yeah, well, we think investment in education is actually a very good idea, but the question we ask is how do you pay for it? And Tony, you can't simply throw out there like confetti all of these promises and not actually account for how you're going to pay for it. Do you know why?
That throws to a question. We can actually talk about the question of how we pay for it through the medium of the following question, which comes from Jonty Katz.
Thank you, Tony. Given the public outrage over the recent cuts being announced in Queensland and New South Wales, the growing debt problems in the USA, and the promises being made by the federal government, it always strikes me that we focus on one side of the equation so much, how to cut spending to pay for these new things, rather than also looking at the inverse, how to raise more revenue. So I ask all the panellists, how do you think we start a mature conversation about tax in our economy, and what contribution would you make to that conversation?
Elliot, do you want to lead us off here? I mean, you can reflect on the previous questions, but is it worth paying more tax for better education, for better social services, for better services for disabled people, people with disabilities?
It's definitely worth paying for those services, but there's two things I'd say which are desperately needed for Australia to avoid becoming a third world economy, basically. If we want to stay a first world economy, we need to do two things. Firstly, we need to massively increase our investment in education. Currently, we spend about 6% of the budget on education. I think we need to raise it about 20% just to equal New Zealand. Really, it should be at least 7.5%, if not 8%, really. And that's so that there's no reason why things like tablets and smartphones can't come from here. If we put that money into education and technology, we can be leading the world instead of just buying all these things that people make in other countries. Now, the second thing that desperately needs to happen is we need to have a very open and mature conversation about unemployment and underemployment. We're currently a population of about 23 million. We have a workforce of approximately 13 million, just under 13 million people. And we keep being told, and we've been told this for probably 25 years before the GFC, that our unemployment rate hovers between about 4 and 6%. That's not actually true. Well, the unemployment rate, depending on how you measure unemployment, and we can talk about that too, the unemployment rate plus the number of people that have given up because they're so discouraged, because they can't find jobs, and then a vast number of people, almost 1 million Australians that are underemployed, and this is what doesn't get talked about. This is about 1 million Australians who desperately want more hours of paid work and they can't get it.
Okay, but I'm going to cut you off there so we'll come back to these issues, or talk about the tax system more directly. And I'm going to go to Jason first of all, and then to the rest of the panel. Huge issue in the United States. I mean, Obama is always accused of trying to tax the wealthy in order to pay for services for the poor.
Well, I mean, I was hearing what you were saying, and I think that even before getting into that, I think the solution to a lot of the problems is to invest in education and technology, particularly the issue of technology, because I think the problem is that people get so stuck in the quagmire of the now that they fail to see the long view, or rather the big picture, because what's actually happening with technology is that technology has been evolving at an exponential rate, which runs counterintuitive to the way our brains are wired. See, our brains see the world in a way that is linear and local. That's the world that our brains evolved in 100,000 years ago. But now we live in a world that's global and exponential. Now, what this means is, for example, Ray Kurzweil, the famous futurist, uses a 30 steps example to explain innovation. He says if you look at it linearly, 30 steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you get to 30. Those are the linear projections that we make about the world when we look into the future. But when you take exponential steps, the same 30 steps, you go 2, 4, 8, 16, 30 steps later, you're at 1 billion. That's the reason why the smartphone in our pockets, okay, is 1 million times cheaper, 1 million times smaller, and 1,000 times more powerful than a $60 million supercomputer that was was half a building in size 40 years ago. So what used to be half a building now fits in your pocket. And in 25 years, it'll fit inside of a blood cell. So I'm more interested in what's being done in places like Singularity University. At the NASA
I'm going to issue you a promise here, and that is that we'll be talking about the future and technology.
Yeah.
We're right now talking about the taxation system.
Just one quick line. We live in a world now where committed individuals and technologists can create the kind of impact and change that only governments and corporations could mere decades ago. So the supercomputers of yesteryear are in everybody's hands. And I'm thinking, let's leverage that to transform the world and stop talking about he said, she said, and all this stuff.
We will come back to that. Mark, yes, go ahead.
Could I just finish my... Jason's taught me how to speak faster. And I'm much indebted. If those people had more hours of work, then they'd they'd pay more tax. And that way the government would have more revenue, and that would be the way to fund all these things that the country desperately needs.
Let's go to Mark Carnegie, because you actually think the government should raise more tax from wealthy people.
Yeah, but be clear what I said.
What are you offering, Mark?
No. What I said was that the top end of town should not, when the National Disability Insurance Scheme is on the table, be talking for funding a sovereign wealth scheme unless they put up themselves. What I said was the top 15% should pay 15% more tax and put it in so that they could fund the sovereign wealth tax so we could have long-term investments to deal with the huge problem we have about the increase in the dependency ratio over time.
I'm going to interrupt you there. The top end of town you talk about has terrific ways to minimise their tax.
Yeah.
In fact, Kerry Packer went to a parliamentary inquiry and said, you're crazy if you're not minimising your tax because governments aren't doing much with your money anyway. That's his philosophy. It's a philosophy of a lot of people. So how would you actually... If you're talking about 15% of their income tax and they minimise their income tax, that's a tiny percentage.
So what I said at the summit, and what's theirs laid out, right, in the tax report, the Henry tax report, is that what you need to do is find some way to remove all of these loopholes. I don't think what the world needs and Australia needs is a higher top income tax rate. I think things like what the Labor Party is doing with the superannuation changes are important. I think changes to family trust arrangements are important. I think finding a way to get capital gains tax closer to income tax is important. I think, negative gearing and abolishing that are all important components of how you are going to end up having a more successful and fairer tax. And, Jason knows because he lives in a country with somebody who got elected, who just turned around and changed the world on the people who lived in Venezuela and tore that economy apart. I think there's a whole series of people in France that look at 75% tax and say, I'm getting the hell out of here. What I was saying to people like me is we live in an immensely privileged country, and a huge amount of why we ended up being successful was because of our country and not ourselves. And we have an opportunity now to put in so we get back later. This is a democracy, and if the other people who are doing poorly in this environment and struggling turn around and say, we want to elect a government that says it's 75% or 90%, or we're going to nationalise the iron ore, the coal and the gas, they can do it. They can take it off us. It was a warning to people like me.
Tanya Plibersek, is that a potential solution? Tax the rich, work out a way of taxing, of actually reducing the loopholes and tax them 15% more, put it in a giant fund in order to pay for these great changes, these great reforms?
Well, we have actually reduced a number of the loopholes, but I think that the more general point of how you raise revenue, it's not just how you spend money, it's how you raise money that's important, and there's fairer ways to spend money and there's fairer ways to raise money. I think the minerals resource rent tax is a great example of a fairer way to raise money, and Mark's mentioned the benefits to superannuation that come from that, the benefits that go into infrastructure as well. The superannuation benefits mean that a 30-year-old on average earnings today will be $108,000 better off when they retire. And people talk a lot about sovereign wealth funds. We've got millions of sovereign wealth funds in Australia because of the investment that we've made in our own superannuation over the years, over the generations.
But can I just bring you to that key point that was just made by Mark beside you? Is it necessary to raise more tax to do these reforms? He believes it is. If so, why not tax the rich more?
Well, no, I think we've got taxation about right. We've actually dropped tax rates, particularly on low-income earners, though. We've raised the tax-free threshold to $18,200, which means
you've increased
a
the tax
whole
rate, though.
a whole lot of people who were.
Well, it's true, you have. You've increased the
Kelly,
we all know the economy's slowing.
I can't hear both at the same time.
No, but Tanya, you know the economy's slowing. You know there's going to be a hole opened up in this year's budget. You've got two choices, debt or tax.
And I'm saying that there are fairer ways to raise money, and the MRRT was a good one. All of the savings measures, I've got to say, that we have proposed, like the
but then why
private
did you gut the MRRT,
just let me finish this one. The private health insurance changes that I took through as Health Minister that actually means tested the private health insurance rebate for wealthier people opposed by the Liberal Party. The closing of the chronic disease dental scheme, a rorted scheme that was introduced by Tony Abbott, replacing it with a fairer dental scheme opposed by the Liberal Party. It is actually very difficult to get any savings measures through the Parliament at the moment, despite the fact that the Liberal Party is out there every 5 minutes saying, where's the money coming from, where's the money coming from? And the 18,000, well, it's called the mid-year economic forecast, Kelly, and the 18,000, no, we don't, Kelly, it comes at the end of the year. It's in the middle of the financial year, which puts it around Christmas time. The $18,200 threshold is a really important one because it actually means that people who are on low incomes, who are working part-time, who have got a second job in a family, don't pay tax. It takes 1 million people out of the tax system. 1 million people out of the tax system. I think that that's the sort of tax reform that has been really important and really beneficial for Australia.
Kelly O'Dwyer.
Well, there's an awful lot to cover in all of this. The first point I just want to make is this idea that just because you spend more means that you care more, I think is quite wrong. You know, you need to actually look at what you get for the money that you spend. The idea that you simply throw money at education and expect that the educational outcomes will be different is not very sensible. You only need to look at the Grattan report. The Grattan Institute did a report just recently where it actually compared our education standards with the rest of the world and the amount of money that we actually spend. Despite the fact that we have been spending more on education, our standards have been slipping. You compare that with, say, a country like Korea, where they've actually been spending not as much money, but the outcomes have been very different, not for cultural reasons, but because they have focused on what is important, which is teacher effectiveness. So that's the number one point.
We're going to fix it by cutting $1.7 billion out of the New South Wales education
Tanya,
system.
I really gave you a really good go. You know, it'd be very nice if you would listen to me as well. The second point I would make in relation to all of this is that simply taxing more is not the only way that you can increase the capacity of government to fund different initiatives. You can actually grow the pie. I know that sounds, really novel
Why didn't you
concept,
use that option with the parental leave scheme?
You can actually, in fact, grow the
just
pie.
Quick interruption there.
Well, Tony, I mean, you didn't interrupt everybody else, and I'm trying
I
to
did,
answer.
actually.
I'm trying to answer your question. The point here.
I'm an equal opportunity interrupter.
Yeah, well, you interrupt me a little earlier than you interrupt everybody else, but that's all right. I don't mind. I enjoy coming on Q&A and having these debates. The point is, the government does not have a very good tax reform record. They talked a lot about tax. They said that they would have a 2020 summit, which would have all these great tax ideas. Then had a Henry tax review that they spent over $10 million of and ignored most of the recommendations and did a number of different things that weren't actually part of that review. They then had another tax summit and again took most of the things off the table. The only people who have actually committed to real tax reform have been the coalition government, in government, where we actually reduce tax. We reduce tax year after year. In these budgets that have been brought forward, it's the first time that a government hasn't actually... Yeah, well, what we did is we got rid of 9 state taxes and the wholesale tax in order to fund the GST. And the GST didn't come to us. The GST actually went to the states to put them on a sustainable footing so that they could fund their services, which is what they need to be able to do.
Who was the government that passed the GST?
So the reason we did that is because we actually wanted to put them on a sustainable footing. It's an important point, though.
Okay.
Can I just
well,
correct
actually, well, yes, you can, but we've got a question from the audience. Let's go back. You think you asked a question earlier. You want to get involved?
So I'm all for having a debate about the pros and cons of the Go and See report or how we spend our money. But my question was actually, should we be having a mature conversation? How do we kickstart it? And what would you like to make?
Do you feel,
I feel as though my question hasn't quite been answered here.
Do you feel the discussion is not mature?
I'd say we're having a very nice debate about who's spending what and how badly they're spending it. But my question is actually, how do we raise money? Should we be raising money? And how do we actually have that debate in a mature fashion without hitting each other over who's spending it badly?
Yeah. Okay. Tanya Plibersek.
I don't think it's fair to say that debate's not happening. I think that it is happening, and it has led to a number of changes, and that's why people are talking about the different ways of raising money and spending money. I can't really. I just can't agree with the proposition that we're not having the debate. I mean, Mark's been making these comments publicly. Many people make comments about how the tax system should be changed. Some of those are taken up with things like the minerals resources rent tax. They're very significant changes to our economy.
Some people would argue that you can't have a mature debate about these things when you rule out any change to the GST, for example, which is the main way for states to get funding.
But even so, I mean, I agree with you. I think the debate on the GST should go up, but I would urge you to read the Henry report. It's beautifully written, it's absolutely clear, and it was a political death warrant. So you wonder why it hasn't happened. The debate's happened. Everybody sits there and says they don't want to blow their head off.
I was referring to the political debate. Sorry, I was referring to the political debate as opposed to the intellectual debate, because I think you get the back and forth over who's spending it badly, and I was more asking about the politicians and why they're not having a mature debate as opposed to anyone else.
Okay, we'll take that as a comment, and we'll move along to our next question, which comes from Newcastle, and it's from Stephen Moore.
Good evening. I'm a recently graduated teacher working here in Newcastle. Educational reforms in Victoria and New South Wales have led to a greater casualisation of the teaching workforce. My question to the panel is, can a student get a quality education from a teacher who doesn't know if they'll have a job next week?
Elliot, can I start with you?
You can, Tony. I would say it's very difficult for anybody teaching anywhere to be doing the very best they can if they live in fear of losing their job. Sometime in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, the government, and for people on the progressive side of politics, it's very sad to admit that it was an ALP government, changed the idea of a university from what it had been for about 1,000 years, which was an institution dedicated to teaching and research for the public good, into an institution that existed largely to make a profit. And once that happened, it put such pressure on the university to raise money, it completely changed the nature of universities.
Jason, I could sort of hear that you wanted to get in from an American perspective. I'm not sure.
Well, you know, my mom's a teacher, and she taught for the last 5 years, actually. Well, she used to teach internationally, but then she taught in the South Bronx for the last 5 years, and it was one of the most underfunded educational districts in the United States. And I heard the horror stories. I knew what the conditions were like there, so I can definitely empathize with the struggle that many teachers face in a lot of places. Having said that, I don't necessarily have the solution, except for the fact that technology, you know, empower teachers and technology. I'm going to bring it back to that.
I promise you we will come to that in more detail. Mark Carnegie.
Sorry, I don't think this one's for me.
Yeah.
You know, I think the threat of a job loss is a hugely, hugely difficult thing for anybody to do, to function inside.
A lot of this debate is arising out of state cuts to public services. Tanya Plibersek.
I think they're disastrous cuts. I think in difficult times governments need to make savings, but cutting frontline health and education services, I think, is a short-term and frankly foolish way of raising money. Education, $1.7 billion cut in New South Wales, teachers sacked in TAFE. People also say, well, you know, a lot of these jobs are in head office. Those jobs are the jobs of the people who support teachers to be better teachers. They're the people who go into underperforming schools and work with that school community to raise the standards of the teaching in that school, so that we're investing in those kids to make sure that they're getting the best teaching. In Victoria, they're selling off TAFE campuses. The massive TAFE cuts have made some TAFEs
should a teacher
unviable.
ever lose their job, according to you, Tanya, then?
Yeah, Kelly, that's just a silly question.
Well, the way that you
if someone is underperforming, yes. In fact, I would make it easier to sack underperforming teachers, but we're not talking about underperforming teachers. We're talking about blunt instrument cuts that are only about saving money, that don't evaluate the quality of the teaching and what this will do to the quality of the teaching. That's what bothers me about these cuts.
Kelly O'Dwyer, and is it these stories, constant stories coming from the States about cuts to public services, education, health, etc., how badly is that hurting you?
Well, look, I think there's a lot of misrepresentation around the cuts that are being spoken about by the government, and I think it's being done for very obvious political purposes. When you look at Queensland, for instance, we heard a lot during the last Parliament about how there are all these cuts, to health, whereas in fact the minister actually increased the health budget by $100 million. No, well, Tanya, you say that and you squirm,
it's
and
indexation, Kelly.
They're actually increasing. They're increasing the budget. Well, you might not like hearing it because it goes against the political attack that you've been focusing on us, but it is a fact. So they've increased the budget. Do I think that, we should be very careful when it comes to frontline services? Absolutely, I do think we need to be very careful. But I think let's be very clear what we're talking about here. We're not simply talking about frontline services. We are talking about people in administration, and sometimes governments have to make difficult decisions. Why do they have to make difficult decisions? Often it's because they've been left with a lot of debt, and at some stage someone's got to pay the bill, and horribly it seems to be the case that when coalition governments come in after the Labor government have spent all of the money, we have to clean up the mess.
So you'll support the savings in the mid-year economic forecast then, Kelly, will you? You'll support our savings when we put them up in the mid-year economic forecast.
We've been asking you to present them, Tanya. So if you present
you
them,
are asking
I'll
a
look
question
at them
and
and
you're
I'll
on the
happily
panel,
answer.
Tanya Plibersek.
Come in the middle of the financial year, that's why it's called a mid-year economic forecast.
No, because I'm going to move along. We've actually got to get to a few other subjects. You're watching Q&A. Our next question comes from Chris Shorrock.
The South African comedy The Gods Must Be Crazy tells the story of Z, a farmer from the Kalahari Desert who has no knowledge of the world beyond. Jason, do the rapid, sometimes exponential developments in technology make believing in a god or gods superfluous as we get closer to doing what some people believe that only gods can do?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think that Stuart Brand said it best in the Whole Earth Catalog. He said we are as gods and might as well get good at it. And Alan Harrington says, having invented the gods, we can turn into them. I mean, increasingly, I think what human beings do is we transcend our boundaries. We didn't stay in the caves, we haven't stayed on the planet, and we won't stay with the limitations of biology. I mean, now Moore's Law, the exponential growth curves of technology, are absorbing biology itself. So now the canvas of life is becoming the new instrument for the artist. So what might we make, So when I say we are the gods now, I think we have transcended the need for traditional religion, because even the need for religion came out of, I don't know if you're familiar with Ernest Becker's work, The Denial of Death. Pulitzer Prize-winning book in 1974, it says that the human condition is characterized by death anxiety, and the religious impulse, the romantic impulse, and the creative impulse are answers to that anxiety about the fact that we are mortal beings.
But people are still going to die, right? I mean, even with a smartphone, you're still going to die eventually.
It's interesting. We're outsourcing more and more of our cognition to our smartphones. We can endlessly upgrade our smartphones. We haven't been able to upgrade our biology, but now we're going to be able to do it. Juan Enriquez talks about life code, and he says, here we have software that can write its own hardware. So when we can master the information processes of biology, why can't we give ourselves indefinite lifespans? I mean, that's the first thing I would think we should do.
How would you pay for all these extra people?
What do you mean how we would pay? We're going to move into
people would still be born, and then the others wouldn't die, and look, you really would have to start thinking about taxation.
No,
then.
By that point we'll be non-biological minds inhabiting virtual spaces. It won't matter. We won't be occupying physical space.
But people like being biological people. People enjoy being human beings.
But this is the thing, is that an interesting thing that I talk about with people, even people always ask me about the overpopulation issue, but you could fit most of the planet into like a single state. The issue is the distribution of resources. The issue is the issue of scarcity that people talk about.
I wouldn't like to live in that state. Can I just say that?
No, but...
Can I say, we've got a follow-up video question from someone who's a little bit sceptical. David Clark in Adelaide, South Australia, and I'll bring the rest of the panel in after you respond to that.
My question is to Jason Silva. I've just looked out the window and can see not one flying car, no hoverboards, no sky elevators to the spaceport, the daily flights to the moon or Mars, and not even a mass transport system into the glass-covered CBD. Where is the future? I keep waiting for it, but it never seems to arrive.
Well, how about this? How about looking at your smartphone as a form of technologically enabled telepathy? How about the fact that you can press a few buttons on a device made of plastic and metal and send your electrified thoughts traveling at the speed of light, transcending the limitations of time, space, and distance? How about flying through the sky in a machine with 1 million moving parts that carries 400 people in perfect safety to across oceans? I mean, we live in that world.
The first of those things we used to do with a telegram.
And people used to be freaked out by it too.
It only took slightly longer.
It took slightly longer. No, but I think increasingly what's interesting is the kind of complexity that's bootstrapping on its own complexity is leading us to a world of wonders that people have begun to call the singularity, because it's a great metaphor to describe what happens when you go through a black hole. Everything that we knew or we thought we knew is no longer applies. And I think that's what's happening now with information technology. We have overlapping revolutions in information technology, in biotechnology, and in nanotechnology, which is mastering matter at the level of the atom. So you have all these things overlapping on top of each other, and it's going to be a game changer. It's going to change everything. And for people that say, where is the future? I mean, we're living it right now. How many hundreds of thousands of people are watching this live? We've been living in the future for 50 years.
And
so
so I'll just make one point, which is that those of you who've actually recorded this can actually slow it down later and understand everything that's been said. Now then, Elliot, what are your thoughts on the future and technology, and will it make us all into gods?
I doubt it. I'm reminded of something that Niels Bohr, probably the 20th century's greatest physicist after Einstein, said. He said that prediction is very difficult, particularly if you're concerned with the future. And it's absolutely fascinating and entertaining to hear you talk. I'd like to hire you out for a party. But,
I just want what he's having, whatever it is.
Well, that's right. But having said that, in the short term and in the medium term, I think people are still going to need jobs, and people are still going to need answers to the metaphysical questions in life, and technology won't answer them. And in the long run...
I disagree with that last part. I think technology increasingly has a great story to tell us. I think it's the next force of evolution. I think the minute that we invented language, as Terence McKenna says, biological evolution essentially ceased, and evolution became this cultural epigenetic phenomenon, because now we take in matter of low organization, as he says, we put it through the filters of the human mind, and it comes out in the form of space shuttles and iPhones. I mean, we live in a world that, to me, is transcendent. We put things together, they work in a certain way, and what results is greater than the sum of its parts.
That's very easy for you to say.
Especially when you've got the footnotes to go with. Mark Carnegie, can I just get your thoughts on technological revolution? Will it change economies? Will it change the way people think? Will it change relationships between people? Is it already doing that?
I think it absolutely is, and I have to say I'm broadly an optimist about the future of the world. I believe, if you look back at fire, which was really the first thing that allowed us to have an organ outside ourselves and was the key thing that meant that we ended up having the brains we had, made us social beings, those sorts of things. What we're seeing at the moment is just a huge, as you say, billion times more sophisticated central repository of a brain, and I think I'm hugely optimistic about it. The one concern / opportunity I see at the moment is all around food. I think what Australia's been a beneficiary of over the last decade has been a hard commodities boom. I turn my mind to the soft commodities boom as we start trying to actually feed the world. You look at 5, 6, 7% unit growth in food consumption and only 1.5% productivity gains. And I think you're going to see the same sort of boom in soft commodity prices. And I think it's another question for the politicians here and around Australia. Can we make sure that this time round we are better prepared for the soft commodity boom than we were for the hard commodity boom? Because it is going to be the last one that actually allows us to find some way to store up some acorns for winter.
We've got a video to come to on this. I'm going to come to that in a second. There's a young lady in the front row who's had a hand up for a while.
Just relating back to your original assertion regarding technology making religion obsolete, can you really say that technology will answer the kind of timeless questions that religion has always supposed to be able to answer, like what happens after death, or more subjective questions regarding morality and things like that?
Yes, I think that experiences of awe are, for me, the most sort of transcendent experiences. I never had them from religion, but I certainly get them when I watch, the Hubble IMAX 3D film. And when you consider what the Hubble is, it's an instrument of man. It's an optic nerve floating in space that allows us to mainline the whole of time through our own optic nerves, to quote my friend Ross Anderson. And so when you consider what that does, to be able to gawk at all of space and time and fit that, something as vast as that, through something as small as our brain, to contemplate and push our perceptual boundaries to such a degree that we have to upgrade our mental schemata just to accommodate the scale of that experience, I say that expands our consciousness. I think that is a psychedelic experience, that is an experience of that which exceeds our intellectual capacity.
She wants to come back at you.
Which is what Joseph Campbell refers to as God to begin with, that which exceeds our intellectual capacity.
That idea of having a transcendent dimension is one of the key facets of